So a very, very warm welcome to this second of our lectures to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the founding of Newnham College in 1871. And we're delighted that Professor Ray Langton, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Newnham, will be giving that lecture. Many of you will know that Newnham has a long history of connections with philosophy, as it was co-founded by Henry Sidgwick. At the time, he was a young radical philosopher without a job, but he later became the Knightsbridge Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge University, the post that Ray Langton holds today. And I'm delighted that moderating the Q&A tonight will be one of my predecessors as Principal of Newnham, Baroness Honora O'Neill, herself an Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge. And she will be putting your questions to Ray at the end of the lecture. Both Ray and Honora epitomise one of the sets of words which Newnhamites told us they associate with Newnham and which are at the heart of our 150th celebrations. Both are thought leaders. A few words to introduce Professor Langton. She was born and raised in India, studied philosophy at Sydney and Princeton, and has taught philosophy in Australia and the US as well as the UK. She works in moral and political philosophy, speech act theory, philosophy of law, the history of philosophy, metaphysics, and feminist philosophy. Ray will be speaking to us on reimagining free speech. As I said, there will be a Q&A section at the end of this event for around 15 minutes. You can submit questions via the Q&A channel that you can see on your Zoom screens throughout the lecture, and Honora and I will keep an eye on them when they come in. But Honora and I will turn ourselves off for the lecture so that you can focus on Ray. So without further ado, Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alison. I'm so glad to be here at this anniversary celebration of 150 years since Newnham's beginnings. We'll be thinking about free speech and perhaps rethinking a little bit. What is speech anyway? What is free speech? Whose voices are enabled and whose voices are excluded? It seems a good place to be thinking about this, given all Newnham has done and keeps on doing, giving so many women a voice in education and the wider world. It seems a good time to be thinking about this as well. We've seen some profound abuses of free speech in recent times, sometimes based on flawed answers to these questions. We've seen old-fashioned state censorship of dissidents and the media, enforced by new forms of electronic scrutiny unimaginable to previous generations. We've seen a different kind of silencing from a recent president of the US, whose drip accusations of fake news media erode credibility without the bother of throwing the journalists in jail. We've seen controversies about free speech in universities and new efforts by the state to punish universities who supposedly get it wrong about free speech and its balancing with other values. The speech of some can obviously silence the speech of others, but whose speech should matter? What speech should matter? And do other things matter too? How do we weigh them all up? Okay, well, we can't possibly answer all these questions, and certainly not today, but we can think a bit harder about speech and about freedom and how we might all have a part to play in making free speech real. I'm glad to be speaking as the Philosophy Fellow at Newnham. As Alison said in her introduction, philosophy has traditionally has had a long association with Newnham, and this is especially important in a context where philosophy is traditionally a rather male field with a bit of an image problem. You think of a philosopher and you think of someone who looks like Dumbledore. So Newnham's been home to a remarkable series of world-leading philosophers who have transformed their disciplines. There was help early on from feminist philosophers who happened to be men, like Henry Sidgwick, who Alison mentioned, who helped found the college in 1871. And J.S. Mill, he gave a speech on women's rights which kindled tenfold the passion for justice for a teenager who happened to be in his audience. That was Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Kindled tenfold is her description. In this remarkable series of philosophers, we're so lucky to have Honora, and especially lucky to have her here today for all kinds of reasons, including her groundbreaking work on trust and the norms of communication, and also a more personal reason. Honora first introduced me to Newnham about 22 years ago with unforgettable warmth and generosity, not to mention grace and patience, and especially patience with the shenanigans of our small toddler in the principal's lodge. I'll draw a veil on that. She turned out very well, by the way. Newnham has had giant figures like Margaret Masterman in the 30s, a pioneer in artificial intelligence, Elizabeth Anscombe and Iris Murdoch in the 40s, Judith Jarvis Thompson and Margaret Bowden in the 50s, a founding figure in cognitive science, more recently Jane Heal, Jen Hornsby, M.M. McCabe, and I must mention Catherine Hawley, whose untimely death many of us are grieving right now. It was only 2 days ago that she died. Catherine studied philosophy of science at the History and Philosophy of Science department here at Cambridge, and she was a fellow at Newnham, and she increasingly came to write, like Honora, about trust and trustworthiness. So I have her in mind as well today. I'm going to suggest a possible reimagining of free speech as a freedom to do things with words. Do things with words. How to do things with words was the title, of course, of J.L. Austin's book about speech act theory, which sometimes is translated as saying is doing. That's its translation in several other languages. Speech requires resources. These resources include rules, directive and empowering rules. So here's my idea for a reimagining in slogan form. Free speech is about the protection and enablement of speech acts that matter. There's a lot there. I'll go over it again. It's about the protection through directive rules of the sort that tell people what to do, and enablement through empowering rules that give you certain capacities of speech acts, that's doing things with words, speech acts that matter given their normative significance. That is a huge topic which I'm not going to do justice to. Anyway, let's begin with the speech in free speech. It's not about opening your mouth or typing some keys and making some meaningful sounds or symbols. It's not even about expressing some ideas. Saying is doing. Speech is doing things with words, as Austin said. Promising. Yes, I'd love to give a Newnham anniversary lecture. Marrying. Yes, I do, and said in the context of a marriage ceremony. Voting, arguing, and so much more. When you say words, your saying can be a doing. You're not describing what you're doing. You are, and I'm quoting HLA Hart, you are not describing what you're doing, you're actually doing it with words. If speech is about doing things with words, then free speech is going to be a freedom to do things with words. What we do with words is sensitive to who we are and where we are, and a whole lot of other things. In On Liberty, his 1859 essay, J.S. Mills said, "An opinion that the corn dealers are starvers of the poor ought to be unmolested when circulated through the press, but may incur just punishment when delivered to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer." What about a president's opinion that an election had been stolen? His opinion that his supporters should fight like hell, delivered to an excited mob before the storming of the Capitol on January 26, 2021. Was that the expression of an opinion? Was it incitement? Saying is doing. What about the free in free speech? Virginia Woolf, right here at Newnham, once argued that a power to speak can require hands-on resources, not just hands-off non-interference. She was talking about the voices of women and what it might take to enable women to speak. When you think of freedom in a hands-off way, you have freedom just as long as no one interferes. When you think of freedom in a hands-on way, you see that freedom might need resources, material resources, social resources, pen, paper, time, education, perhaps active involvement of the state or institutions, perhaps other ordinary people like you and me listening. For some kinds of speech, it might need a room of one's own, of Woolf's title. We'll be looking at a different sort of resource that comes from certain kinds of rules, legal rules and social rules. Material resources matter too, but I'll set the room of one's own idea aside. In COVID times, some of us who've been stuck in a room of one's own might be getting a bit sick of it, although it is, of course, wonderful that technology enables us to be here together, in some sense of together. The power to speak can require hands-on resources, and I love the way Virginia Woolf gets across the continuity and interrelatedness of these powers of speaking, writing, reading, even walking, and how they can get thwarted. Her protagonist, who gets barred so civilly from the college library and barred so officiously from the lawn by the dreaded beagle, the dreaded beadle, keep off the grass. That's a nice resonance with our anniversary anthology with its Newnham memories of walking on the grass and dancing in the corridors. The point we draw from Woolf is that it can take more than a hands-off approach to give someone a proper voice. And this, of course, has been equally a theme in Mary Beard's marvelous work on the public voices of women. She reminds us, Mary does, of the well-known deafness that's nicely parodied in the old Punch cartoon of the boardroom. That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. Mary connects this with other disempowerments and with the threats and punishments that face women who do speak up, drawing on her own extraordinary experience on that score. I'd like to go beyond the system of orders, threats, and punishments, all those directive rules which say hands off to some speakers and hands off to some would-be censors of speech. I want to pursue the hands-on idea that free speech needs resources. Education matters to giving women a voice, literacy matters, and we can think of free speech as a capability or a power that needs resources. This is somewhat in parallel to the capability approach which Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen have pioneered in economics. I myself was brought up in a part of the world where women did not and still cannot read or write, or most women couldn't. Alison mentioned that I was brought up in India. Women's literacy was about 7% in our district around our Kashmiri village. I've only got the 81 figures. They were probably lower before that when I was growing up there. In what meaningful sense did those women in our village have free speech? That harsh reality and my own good fortune is something I continue to feel very keenly. Here's one more thing about the free in free speech. Free doesn't mean cheap. Freedom has costs, as Hart remarked. Any scheme providing for the general distribution in society of liberty of action, he said, not only gives individuals the advantages of that liberty, but also, and now I'm quoting HLA Hart, it also exposes them to whatever disadvantages the practices of that liberty by others may entail for them. These disadvantages include not only interference with another individual's liberties, but also various forms of harm, pain, suffering, and the destruction of forms of social life or amenities which otherwise would have been available. Hart's attention to the costs of liberty is a prescient warning for some free speech pathologies of our time, with their various forms of harm, pain, and suffering, destruction of forms of social life or amenities, including damage to the democratic process itself, often done for profit by agents who do not speak as individual citizens or human beings, but as corporations, state and political parties, and machines, robot algorithms. Nora has some wonderful work on this. Technology has scaled it up to a degree that would have astonished J.S. Mill, with its instant readiness to propagate a message around the world in an avalanche of lies and, I'm afraid, bullshit. Let me hasten to add that I mean bullshit in a technical sense, just in case you think I'm lowering the tone. According to Harry Frankfurt, who wrote an essay and then a book whose title is simply Bullshit, Harry Frankfurt says, the bullshitter is neither on the side of the true nor on the side of the false. He does not care whether the things he says describe reality correctly. He just picks them out or makes them up to suit his purpose. Post-truth, fake news, alternative facts. This is probably about bullshit just as it is as much about lies. I don't want to depress you too much, but I would like to point out that our present and recent rulers are actually self-described bullshitters. By self-described, I mean that their self-descriptions match Harry Frankfurt's description of the bullshitter. When Trump contradicted Justin Trudeau about Canada having no trade deficit with the USA, Trump said, "Wrong, Justin, you do." And then later on he bragged, "I didn't even know. I had no idea. I just said, you're wrong." When Boris Johnson described his journalistic, when he described his journalistic writing back in Brussels, composing foam-flecked hymns of hate to the latest Euro infamy, that's his description, you know the sort of thing. Bureaucrats ban bendy bananas, one-size-fits-all Euro condoms, snails classified as fish, all that sort of thing. Anyway, here's what Boris said. "I was sort of chucking these rocks over the garden wall, and I listened to this amazing crash from the greenhouse next door over in England. It really gave me this, I suppose, rather weird sense of power." Bullshit. The costs of liberty were noted by Mill, who assumed that the cost of rioting and the possible murder of the corn dealers might be a bit too high. And different costs have long been discussed by feminists and critical race theorists. There's a famous collection called Words That Wound by a series of critical race theorists. Feminists have written about pornography. Others have written about hate speech. Pornography as increasingly the go-to source of sex education, accessed by children, used as an instruction manual, normalizing objectification and violence. Hate speech and conspiracy theories, selling division and hate, instructing deadly attacks on believers at worship, mass shootings of children in school. There's been increasing concern about more basic costs in damage to the democratic process itself and what voting means in a system like this. And I want to refer you again to Honora's work on this. When there are conflicts between liberty and other values and conflicts within liberty itself, Hart said we must consider their relative value. We must ask what matters more. So we're thinking of free speech as a power to do things with words, which may require not only hands-off non-interference, but also hands-on resources, not just material resources, but resources supplied by certain kinds of rules, both legal and social. What rules? Hart distinguished two kinds of legal rule, and I think this is important. Some rules direct us. They tell us what to do. They say, for instance, no women in the library, or they say, keep off the grass. Rules like that are commands. They're backed by threats and punishments. They impose duties. But other rules, and he's talking about legal rules, other rules do something quite different. They confer powers, as he said. Empowering rules, in particular, have potential, I think, to shed new light on our understanding of speech, of silence, and of the freedom to speak. Here's Hart on empowering rules. They provide individuals with facilities for realizing their wishes by conferring legal powers on them to create, by certain specified procedures and subject to certain conditions, structures of rights and duties. The power conferred on individuals to mold their legal relations with others by contracts, wills, marriages, etc., is one of the great contributions of law to social life. And it is a feature of law obscured by representing all law as a matter of orders backed by threats. Hart is saying something important, and it builds on the work of his teacher, J.L. Austin. Some legal rules give us powers to do things, including powers to do things with words, such as making a contractual promise, or legally marry someone, or create a will, or transfer ownership. I hereby give Alison my gold pen, I might say. The law creates these powers by specifying certain procedures and conditions that enable us to create structures of rights and duties, empowering us to mold our relationships with each other. Empowering rules don't tell us what to do or what not to do. They give us resources which empower us as doers, resources we otherwise wouldn't have to do some important things with words. Hart thought this aspect of the law, this power conferring role, had been wrongly neglected by his predecessors. He wanted to put these sorts of rules under the spotlight, and he called them one of the great contributions of law to social life. In support of the distinctiveness of power conferring rules, Hart pointed out that non-compliance with such rules results in something quite different. If we don't comply with the conditions on a will, for example, it will be what he calls a nullity, without legal force or effect. It will not be a breach or a violation of any obligation or duty. Hart's point is that failure to comply with a rule about the conditions on making a will, if that's what you want to do, or marrying someone, if that's what you want to do, if you don't comply with those conditions, that is not disobedience. You're not disobeying a directive. If you get it wrong, you haven't done something that violates a duty. Actually, you've failed to do something at all. Your attempted speech act is a nullity. Your speech act has misfired in the terms that J.L. Austin introduced. Austin, remember, was H.L.A. Hart's teacher. And so this is a really interesting connection between philosophy of language and a very important work in philosophy of law. Here are some favorite examples from J.L. Austin about misfire, as he called it, or nullity, as Hart called it. Austin's example, and this is completely typical, are hilarious and surreal. So here's Austin, an authorized official. This isn't quoting him, I'm just telling you his examples. An authorized official stands ready to name a ship the Queen Elizabeth, but a low type, that is a quote, a low type runs up, grabs the bottle, smashes it against the prow, crying, "I hereby name this ship the Generalissimo Stalin." Austin says, we can agree that would be an infernal shame, but we can agree that it also didn't count as the naming of the ship. Suppose someone tries to marry, they say, "I do," but it doesn't count because, Austin's example, the prospective spouse is a monkey. Or suppose a short-sighted saint sprinkles water on the inhabitants of a remote island. "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." It doesn't count as a baptism because, Austin's example again, they are penguins. That example of trying to baptize the penguins is from a novella by Anatole France. I won't tell you what happens in the end. It's actually quite interesting. Okay, so what's going on in these cases is there is a misfire or a nullity because the conditions for the relevant speech act are not fulfilled. The want of authority for the naming of the ship, the want of a suitable spouse for the marriage, the want of a soul for the baptism. Back to Hart's more ordinary example, the want of an adequate capacity or minimum personal qualification, perhaps, for executing a will. The empowering rules then specify the conditions for success, and here is the key thing. In so doing, they also create the conditions not just for success, but also for failure, the potential for misfire or nullity. This concept of misfire or nullity is going to help us not only to reimagine speech, but to reimagine silence. If speech is doing things with words, then silence involves failing to do things with words. Perhaps because your voice is censored through a directive rule that says, "shut up," or else. Or perhaps because your voice is disempowered. Your attempt is a misfire in Austin's terms, or in Hart's terms, a nullity. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. So we've already done a bit of rethinking. We're familiar with the idea that free speech involves the protection of speech through rules. We usually think of these as directive rules, which permit speech and prohibit restrictions and penalties on speech. But what if free speech requires empowerment too, as well as an absence of a ban or penalty? And what if empowering rules are needed not just for ceremonial speech acts, like making a will or voting or marrying someone, but also for more ordinary communicative speech acts? I'm going to mention those in sexual context because I'm especially interested in speech acts of sexual consent and refusal and other kinds of sexual negotiation. And also perhaps even ordinary communicative speech acts. When we talk with each other, all of those are the traditional province of free speech. I want to imagine free speech not just as a hands-off absence of bans and penalties, but a hands-on enablement of certain speech powers, capacities without which we are perhaps not fully citizens at all. While Hart distinguished two kinds of rules in the law, the same two kinds of rules appear in the social realm. Free speech is achieved, I think, through social rules as well as legal ones. Free speech is achieved not by law alone, to borrow St. Paul's phrase, which has been invoked nicely in this connection in a recent book by Timothy Garton Ash. The law matters, yes, but social rules too, including the rules that direct and also rules that empower. Hart's distinction applies to social rules that constrain and empower our speech. And who builds those rules? We all do, together. To be a speaker, then, is to have certain powers to do things with words. And some of these powers need the law, not just for their protection, but for their very being. It's this role which Hart described as one of the great contributions of law, giving us power to mold our relationships. When we follow certain specified procedures, subject to certain conditions, we're able to perform speech acts that maintain or alter or control our social and our normative landscape. Many of our speech powers don't need the law for their very being. One mentioned by Hart is the power to promise. We may need a social practice, but this might not need the law, even though certain promises, like those involved in contract, do need the law. Many other speech powers don't in themselves need the law for their being. The power to assert or argue or testify or tell each other things, the power to protest or criticize. These powers are the stuff of communicative speech. Unlike the power to marry or make a will, these don't need the law for their existence, but they might need the law for their protection. Now, I want to bring in here something Honora has said. She has said our problem when it comes to norms of communication, our problem is not a shortage of trust, it's a shortage of trustworthiness. I agree with this, and I would connect it with the following idea. Rules of truth and truthfulness are not just social rules, not just moral rules that are directive rules that say don't lie or don't bullshit or else. They are also empowering rules that enable us to perform speech acts, including speech acts of assertion, speech acts of communication, speech acts of telling each other things. You only have to think about where we go with the boy who cried wolf to see how that is so. The boy who cried wolf, in the end, cannot warn of the wolf. If somebody else says that boy always lies when he cries wolf, that person, the boy is silenced just as surely as he would be as he would have silenced himself. Lot to say here, but I'll press on with what I want to say so that I've got time for you to come in, because I'm very curious as to what you have to say about this too. So we're focusing then on private powers to mold our relations with each other through speech acts that allow ordinary people to create structures that bind us in ties of obligation and intimacy with other ordinary citizens. There are social norms comparable to the law of the empowering kind. The power to promise the power to protest or criticize, the power to consent in sexual contexts, even the power to tell people ordinary things about the weather. All these need social norms. We sometimes call those norms conventions, and we sometimes call the powers they enable deontic powers, but I'm not going to go into all of that here. As we reimagine speech as doing things with words, we're taking this to involve the exercise of powers, some of which need empowering rules of the law for their being, and some of which need empowering social norms for their being. If speech is about doing things with words, then silence, as I said, is about failing to do things with words. Here is one way. Your speech gets banned and censored. You are punished if you speak. You are silenced by a rule of heart's first kind, a directive rule, which is like an order backed by threats and sanctions. That's what first comes to mind when you think about how speech can fail to be free. But here is another way. You lack the power to speak in heart's sense of a power. Or perhaps something has got in the way of you exercising your power. Your attempt to speak will be a misfire, as Austen put it, a nullity, as Hart put it. When this happens, it may be that you've been silenced by a rule of the second kind, an empowering rule, which at the same time disempowers. Corresponding to Hart's two kinds of rule, then, are two kinds of silence. Remember that a misfire occurs for Austen when the conditions for a speech act are not fulfilled. A nullity for Hart ensues when, as he says, some essential conditions for the exercise of the power is not fulfilled. When you fail to do something this way, it's not like being coerced by a directive. It's not like obeying, obeying an order to, or disobeying an order to be quiet, backed by a threat or penalty. You might not in fact be quiet at all. And your failure to do what you are meaning to do is, as Hart rightly said, not itself a sanction or penalty. Hart made a point about this. The provision for a nullity is part of the rule itself. If failure to get the ball between the posts, and now he's talking about a special kind of rule, the rules of, let's say, football. If a failure to get the ball between the posts didn't mean the nullity of not scoring, the scoring rules could not be said to exist. In that analogy between our speech situation and the rules of football, what Hart is doing is bringing in the idea that his empowering rules are the constitutive rules that make space for possible things we can do. You couldn't score a goal if it weren't for the rules of football that enable you, that make space for scoring a goal. They don't tell you to score a goal, but they do make space for you scoring a goal. And in the same way, the rules that govern language and communication make space for us to do things with words. The empowering rule creates the possibility of things going wrong, possibility of misfire, when those conditions that don't obtain. So you thought that empowering rules were a good thing, but now I've said that empowering rules actually create the space not only for a new kind of doing, but also a new kind of failure. When misfires occur, you might say the right words, but the problem is they're not the right speech act. You use the right locution, as Austen put it, but it lacks the right force as a speech act, illocutionary force, as Austen put it. Now, I think Austen is right to be positive about this role of the law, but I want to bring out the dark cloud between that silver lining. The law's empowering role is also one of its most grotesque and oppressive contributions to social life. We regularly mold our legal relations with each other for ill and not for good when it comes to property, employment, contract, and marriage, yielding familiar patterns of exploitation and inequity. The social world we build through the exercise of our powers includes just and unjust relationships of obligation and intimacy. The rules that empower can also, by that very token, disempower. In creating new possibilities for success, they create new possibilities for failure. In creating powers for some, they take away powers from others. You'll remember Austen's surreal examples: trying to marry a monkey, trying to name a ship when you're the low type, trying to baptize the penguins when you're a short-sighted saint, mistaking them for the human inhabitants of the island. Here are some more salient ones that have the same structure. Someone tries to marry, they say I do, but it doesn't count because the prospective spouse is a man and so is the speaker. Someone tries to vote, but it doesn't count because the speaker is black in apartheid South Africa. Someone tries to refuse sex, saying no, but it doesn't count because she is a wife and he is her husband. And now I am quoting Sir Matthew Hale, the wife hath in marriage given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract. So in the days when it was impossible for there to be such a thing as marital rape, a wife was counted as having already consented. In each case, the Speech Act faces a problem, not because what is said is banned or penalized, but because the conditions for its success have not been fulfilled. The speaker doesn't have the power or can't exercise the power because something has got in the way. The speaker can say her words, but she's silenced in her Speech Act. This is the silence of what I have called elsewhere illocutionary disablement. It's the silence of misfire. Your Speech Act itself is disabled. You say the words, but you're not doing what you're trying to do with your words. Let's emphasize again that this is not the same as a directive which resembles an order backed by threat. Being unable to vote is different to being ordered not to vote. Being unable to marry is different from being ordered not to marry. In these sorts of examples, the law itself silences the speech of some citizens by disabling or disempowering rather than by banning. A disempowering law that makes it impossible for some citizens to vote or marry or refuse sex silences its citizens not through a directive rule that censors them, but through an empowering rule which empowers some and disempowers others. Social rules can do the same. Here is an example, and I've written about this elsewhere. Some feminists have argued that pornography is like the law for women. That is a radical and striking claim, and some will think an implausible claim. I think we can interpret it in Hart's way. I'm drawing here on the work of Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. Interpreting it in Hart's way, we say that pornography enacts directive rules backed up by sanctions about how to have sex or about how to treat women. It enacts empowering and disempowering rules about what counts as a man or what counts as a woman, and what counts as a speech act of consent or refusal. Here's an example illustrating this idea from Andrea Dworkin. Pornography, she says, is the Bible of sexual abuse. It is chapter and verse. Pornography is the law on what you do to a woman when you want to have mean fun on her body and she's no one at all. There's a different idea, the idea of a disempowering role in Catherine McKinnon's work. For instance, in this passage, she says, together with all its material supports, authoritatively saying someone is inferior is largely how structures of status and differential treatment are demarcated and actualized. Words and images are how people are placed in hierarchies, how social stratification is made to seem inevitable and right, how feelings of inferiority and superiority are engendered, and how indifference to violence against those at the bottom is rationalized and normalized. She describes a kind of authoritative speech which is not only directive, but creates the space for action, just as the law creates spaces for action. It puts people into hierarchies, giving some people some powers, taking powers from others, including speech powers. She says, the free speech of men silences the free speech of women. It is the same social goal, just other people. Well, that's one way the free speech of women get silenced, not by being banned, but by being disempowered. In a 2013 government study of teenage perspectives on sex, it appeared that consent and refusal weren't always visible as consent and refusal to many teenagers. According to British law, someone sexually consents only if he or she agrees by choice and has the freedom and capacity to make that choice, as the Sexual Offences Act says. In the study I'm thinking of, a series of fictional vignettes were presented where consent, described in terms of that law, was entirely absent, but the adolescent viewers tended to see consent as present and as shown, for example, in the clothes a girl was wearing. In one vignette, a 14-year-old girl was gang raped by 3 boys, and in teenagers' responses to that rape scenario, they explained why, although she said no, her clothes were somehow saying yes. It was her fault for wearing that top. It started off with that top saying, it's like a door saying fire exit, you're going to go through that if there's a fire. Yes, big flashing sign saying come to me. It's like a sign on your head saying shag me. Her top was like a sign on her head saying, shag me. This, in practice, is what silencing can look like in the absence of a good empowering rule that makes a speech act of refusal real, and the presence of a bad empowering rule that makes a girl's clothes seem to say more than her voice. This is all unfinished business, but we see that corresponding to Hart's 2 kinds of rules, there are 2 kinds of silence, one a directive or ban, and the other a nullity in Hart's sense, or a misfire in Austin's sense. His insight, Hart's insight about 2 kinds of rules, we're extending that to 2 kinds of social norms, one creating directives and imposing penalties, the other creating powers for action that empower some and disempower others. This surprising feminist claim that pornography is like the law can be unpacked in these terms, as a system of directives and a system of empowerings that also disempower. It can say, do sex this way, treat women this way or else, and it can say, this is what counts as consent, just like Hart talked about, this is what counts as a will. The former corresponds to Hart's first kind of rule, a directive rule, and the latter corresponds to his second kind, an empowering rule. Okay, so we've been reimagining free speech as the protection and enablement of speech acts that matter through these 2 kinds of rules, and that matter given their normative significance. Now, I haven't said much about that. Hart said that in the face of conflict, there is no dodging the question about what matters. Free speech involves doing things with words where those doings matter, and they matter more than the values they threaten. So what matters? That is a huge question. I'm not going to answer it here, and we needn't in any case expect a simple or unified answer. I'll mention one answer though, going back to Mill. Mill famously proposed that free speech matters because it is a route to truth or knowledge. He thought that this might not just need the law, it might need the rest of us. It might need active hearers and bystanders, since, as he puts it, truth has no chance, but in proportion as every side of it, every opinion which embodies even a fraction of the truth, not only finds advocates, but is so advocated as to be listened to. He also said that all of us are involved, because what it takes for evil to succeed is for others to look on and do nothing. One more thing, just finally, on diversity and disagreement and a healthy dose of humility and the idea of free speech as an experiment in living. Here's Mill. As it's useful that while mankind are imperfect, there should be different opinions, so it is that there should be different experiments in living, and that the worth of different modes of life should be proved practically. So perhaps there's more we could do to prove free speech practically. That's enough for now. I've been doing things with words for plenty of time now. It's your turn.
Well, thank you, Ray, for such a lucid talk, drawing in so many examples from Newnham and so many examples that just make you think I think particularly in an academic world where words matter, and also we're about empowerment through education. These are all such important concepts. I love the positive way you say we have no option to do better, but to try and do better, particularly those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democracies. But of course, we would hope everybody would have the chance to be empowered. So thank you very much. Thank you both of you. Thank you everybody for attending. As I say, this talk will be available in a couple of weeks for you to re-listen and to mull further. So thank you, Ray. Thank you, Honora. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Beth, for all the technical backup, and have a good weekend, everybody.